So anyway, welcome everybody to this Parallax Roundtable, formerly Sweeny versus Bard, but now it's something else. It's Bard, Hamelryck, Sweeny, and last, or whoever shows up to have our wild conversations. Today the topic is capitalism, attentionalism, and mimetic theory. This was Alexander's suggestion, and also with the subtitle Hegel, Réne Girard, and Nietzsche. So it's a long title. I'm wondering how all these things are linked together. So maybe we'll just jump in, and Alexander can start and kind of guide us a little bit on where he wants to go here.
Well, I think we all agreed in previous conversations that the comparative study of Hegel and Whitehead is something we're going to pursue this year in 2022. It also happens that Cadell and I have decided to put Hegel and Nietzsche into a particle accelerator and then crush them against each other repeatedly and then study the outcomes and write a book based on that. Because Hegel and Nietzsche are obviously the two giants of European philosophy, and they should be smashed against each other because we actually think that deep is down, they actually agree on most things, and that could be really interesting. And of course, then we know that Thomas Hamelryck is a huge fan of Réne Girard, who isn't. Either you think Réne Girard is the most important thinker ever, or you just happen to think that he's the most important thinker of our times.
He's not a fan. He's possessed by Réne Girard.
That's fine. We need a Girard.
Not only a fan, and just as Cadell is possessed by Hegel. These are possessed people.
Yeah, they are definitely possessed. And I'm not possessed by Nietzsche, of course I'm not, right?
No.
So I don't memetically desire to be Nietzsche all the time. By the way, he didn't want to be Wagner. We take it back to that later. He wanted to be Nietzsche, right? But anyway, so mimetic theory is incredibly applicable. And what's interesting today, I had a class even today at the Stockholm School of Economics, and there's nothing that upsets people more these days than to tell them capitalism is dead. Because the capitalists think capitalism is the most important thing ever, and it's their religion, and therefore capitalism is more important than ever. And the anti-capitalists, of course, hate to hear that capitalism is dead because then they don't have a ghost that can explain absolutely everything that they attack. So it doesn't matter if you're kind of a cliched radical left or a radical right, or you're liberal, whatever you are, capitalism apparently is dead important to absolutely everybody. So you can't say anything more controversial these days to say that people are just stuck in an obsessed with mimetic desire, Girard's point. And you can also not say anything more controversial these days to say that capitalism is dead and it's being replaced by something called attentionalism, something we've only just begun to understand. And therefore, I think to do Hegel, Nietzsche, Whitehead, Girard, and throw up all these four thinkers against the wall and see what we can get out of them, I think the perfect theme today in 2022 to do that is to address capitalism and attentionalism, and wanted to address them both through the window of mimetic theory, mimetic desire, and see where we arrive. I think that could be a really fruitful conversation.
Okay, maybe we can start with Hegel. Just because I want to also mention that Cadell is doing this enormous conference on Hegel, which he's put in 4 years of his life studying the phenomenology of spirit, and it's this epic thing that he's doing right now. So maybe just to mention that to everybody, to mention Cadell's work on Hegel, and see if maybe we can. Well, I've been thinking about the difference between dialectics and mimetic theory as best I can, not knowing Hegel very well, and I'm wondering about that, Cadell.
Okay, just a sec. All right. Well, I mean, where to start? I think with the title Capitalism, Attentionalism, and Mimetic Rivalry, and the question of what's the difference between, say, mimetic rivalry and the function of the dialectician.
Mm-hmm.
I'm increasingly starting to see that, at least in my view, the function of the dialectician is to develop a more mature relationship to rivalry, to try to work with rivalry, try to move through or work through one's own unconscious, the way one's own unconscious creates rivalries, engages in low-level conflict, and not to eliminate conflict, but to, again, to mature it, or to transform it into a higher end, or for a higher purpose. And I think that I mean, the best place for me to stay grounded with that is just simply in relationship to the three of you, because I think there are many ways in which we could engage in unconscious rivalries with each other, but there's many ways in which, if we have I think a more mature relationship to our own identities, there's huge possibilities for transformation of desire, and transformation of the possibilities of collaboration between us. So I would just sort of start there.
Great, wonderful. So one of these potential, let's say, rivalries, and I guess, you know, each of us have sort of affinities with different philosophers, and so we tend to see the world through those philosophers. And so there's a critique of Hegel and psychoanalysis by Girard. So maybe we could just have a look at that and have a, you know, an interesting back and forth about that. What do you think, Thomas? Do you want to outline that and have, you know, Cadell and Alexander respond?
Well, we have like these huge topics, right? So there's Hegel, Nietzsche, and Girard. That's already incredibly big, and now we have attentionalism and capitalism. So yeah, what are we actually discussing?
Well, the critique.
I would like to start with a question. You know, like, so what's the difference between capitalism and attentionalism? Because so just to play advocate of the devil, right? I mean, I don't know anything about economics, but not knowing anything has never stopped me from having an opinion or making a lot of noise. So let's start there.
Since I defined attentionalism, maybe I should then define it here.
Yeah, but wait.
So,
let me formulate the question. So capitalism, I think, has always so memeticism has always been very important for capitalism, because like the independent consumer who has these individual needs, who is rational about these needs, and then engages in the economy and then creates a market, that seems to be a complete pipe dream if everybody is constantly comparing himself with somebody else, you know, like keeping up with the Joneses. So people are constantly looking at other people to figure out what they actually want. So you have these big networks of desire, right? So attentionalism, so copying, looking at what other people are doing, has always been very important. And now in the age of the internet, we actually have hyperlinked everybody in this super close way, in this super dense way. So we get it's like capitalism on steroids, right? So is that what you mean with attentionalism, or is there something else going on? Is there some kind of phase transition?
Thomas, turn up your microphone because you're way less loud than everybody else, if you can.
I'm afraid that this is all I have for you tonight.
Okay.
You'll have to do it with that.
It's fine, Thomas. It's fine. It's okay. Okay, I can answer that. So you must not think economics when you think attentionalism. When you hear the term attention economy, it's certainly for somebody like Tristan Harris hasn't understood a word here. Okay. Economics is tied to capitalism. What happened was that starting in the 14th century in Venice, exchange became incredibly more efficient for the simple reason that we could go from barter trade to trading the symbolic. And the symbolic was then a jump between another barter trade and the previous one. So for example, that instead of you and I having to wait, Thomas, for us to be able to barter trade something, you could just give me money, or I could just give you money, and you can then keep the money, the capital, and that's what's called capitalism. You could pass it on in a later trade. And you could therefore accumulate money, you could invest the money, and you could get payback for that. What capitalism did undoubtedly, and why it won eventually across the world, was that it removed enormous amounts of bullshit in social relations. Karl Marx agrees on that, the capitalists agree on that. So what happened was that we had snake oil salesmen in every street corner of the world until the 14th century could brag and say anything they liked about the product and fool us into believing anything you wanted. There was nothing but fake reports about everything everywhere. What happened with capitalism was that if somebody stood in the street corner and bragged about their product or their service, you could just go after them and say, yeah, but what's the price? And you immediately exposed them. And they had to admit that there was a price at which they would gladly give away whatever they had that was so priceless because it had a price. And of course, this concerned absolutely everything. This is exactly why prostitution is controversial, but also philosophically very interesting, because it turned out that even sex could be sold and purchased and things like that too. Women discovered that, and that's exactly why they got wealthy out of doing it. They're called brothel madams, and I love them for it. So you can't trade love, but you can trade sex. It's a perfect example of something you can trade and something you cannot trade. The problem with capitalism is that it therefore created enormous amounts of wealth. And it turned out that it didn't matter how wealthy we got. We still were rivalrous. We still went into mimetic rivalry. And that's exactly why Girard is so interesting to read at the end of capitalism. That's why I strongly advocate Girard these days, if nothing else, because he's a great thinker of the times we live in. Okay? What then has happened is, with the arrival of the internet, is that the algorithm has come into history. And with algorithms have come data collection. So we collect the data, we process the data. It then turns out that all the information we'd ever like to have about a certain product or a certain service in a market, for example, we can now get through the algorithm. And algorithms are far better than the sort of bragging that advertising and commercial messages and things like that deliver to us. That means I'm basically teaching that advertising is over. One of my one-liners is that the abolition of advertising will one day be seen as a greater achievement than the abolition of slavery. We hate spam. We hate commercials. We hate advertising. We hate commercialism with a vengeance, because it just reveals the worst sides of us, and it doesn't help us in anything we pursue in our lives. So what is even more precious to us than capital is attention. For really, really poor people, they sell everything. They sell their own kids, right? But if you're slightly fortunate in life, you achieved a certain capital accumulation, or you can go to the bank, and these days you can get money for virtually nothing from the bank. You basically liberated yourself from the absolute pursuit of money, and therefore money doesn't give you social hierarchy any longer. The way nobility didn't give you social hierarchy during capitalism, these days capital doesn't give you social hierarchy any longer. Only Russian oligarchs still believe you can pay your way into anything in your life. Nobody else believes that any longer. Why? Because he moved on to an attentionalist society. Now it is rather, if you pursue certain things in your life and you end up top of the algorithm because people think you stand for the ultimate quality in whatever you pursue, then you get all the attention of everybody else. And that's not by giving them a product or a service that they can buy. It's by basically being somebody they want to have access to. Because the world now completely operates according to network dynamics. The new social hierarchy is network dynamical. It's a social hierarchy between networks. The next rivalry is going to be one network envying another network. It's not going to be between individuals any longer. It's going to get much more complex. Another reason why we need to study Girard. That means we need mimetic theory for attentionalism as well. We only started developing the idea of attentionalism. But all I'm saying is that the realm of the private and the realm of the sacred was directly under attack from capitalism. And the way we responded to that was by saying that capitalism can rule the profane, and capitalism can rule in the public, but capitalism must not be led inside the private and the sacred. This is why we talk about religion and spirituality these days. We talk about what is actually sacred to me. What can I afford to make sacred? What can I say nobody can buy from me? Love, sincerity, honesty, the things that I'm devoted to, the purpose of my life. None of these things can be bought. We don't think that a paycheck every month gives us any meaning any longer. It's nothing but a paycheck. And once the paycheck has fixed the other things in life, we pursue other things in our lives. This is an attentionalist society. And even if the algorithms today are crappy, I strongly predict Google is dead, because Google have too many ads now that are interfering with the algorithm. They used to have the ads on the right side, and we didn't click the ads any longer. By 2012, 99% of our clicks in Google search were directly on the algorithm. And Google hated that because they couldn't make money any longer because their old paradigm. And then Google started forcing the ads at the top of the page. But I can tell you this, I'm prepared to pay for an algorithm that cleans out the ads completely and throw them out the bin. And I'm prepared to pay for an algorithm that gives me antagony instead. It says that here's exactly what you want and what you're looking for. But why don't you surprise yourself by pressing this button, and something that irritates you and challenges you comes into your flow. And funny enough, people love that. It turns out people want to be antagonic. At least a tenth of the hits they do want to be antagonic. We also want to be global and local. I want to know, where does my algorithm put me when I look at something global? Which is the best restaurant in the world is fine. But when I'm going out for dinner in Stockholm tonight, I want to know the best local restaurant. Global, local, algorithm, antagonic. These are the things we really want for the algorithms. And I think eventually we're going to get those algorithms. If you have to pay for them, we don't care. So the algorithms aren't fully developed, we're moving there. And with blockchains tied to the algorithms, my God, we're going to create a monster that, just like capitalism did 600 years ago, is going to kill bullshit in social relations all the way through. And we're going to arrive at an absolute, almost horrible, monstrous honesty in human relations that I find incredibly challenging and really, really fascinating. That is what attentionalism does. And the question then is, what would it mean if networks become envious of other networks and go into mimetic, desire, and mimetic competition with one another? For example, that we see in subcultures today online, currently with the COVID-19 pandemic being badly handled and all that. I mean, what kind of message do we have in front of us? What kind of apocalyptic states are awaiting us when we shift the mimetic rivalry from individuals over to the networks themselves? I think that's the question for tonight.
There's kind of a link to what Cadell was saying as well, because Cadell was talking about the need for mature rivalry, between people, and that is kind of related to what you're saying, I think.
Are you kidding? I mean, if we dealt with mimetic rivalry between people, like the four of us or whatever, it's nothing compared to monstrous challenge we got ahead of us. We need to read Girard more than ever. And I think we need to invite Girard into a Hegelian dialectic to get more out of Girard, so that we can start think more Girard than Girard himself. Because by God, that's what's required over the next 30, 40 years.
Can I go back to my question, which I don't think Thomas was answering? What is the critique of Girard against Hegel? Because the way I understand it is, Girard's critique against Hegel is saying that Hegelian dialectics will just lead to this endless antagony, right? And I'm sure, I'm not saying that I think that's true or not. I'm just that I believe that that's the critique of Girard, correct?
So I can tell you what Girard wrote about it, right? So Girard basically, so there are two things about Hegel. First of all, desire in Hegel is dyadic. So it's the desire is desire for the attention of the other. While in the case of Girard, desire is triangular. So you desire an object that somebody else also wants. So that's one thing. The second thing is that you have this dialectics, which seems to be overly optimistic. And Girard actually says well, he might be more arguing against the Hegelians than against Hegel himself. So I'm kind of trying to protect myself against Cadell's devastating attack that is on the way. Okay, so Girard says, well, dialectic seems to be optimistic in the sense that it assumes that you have just to simple it, make it very simple. I know that Hegel never wrote this. You have the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, right? It's as if conflict kind of comes together and it goes up into a higher order. And Girard basically says that, well, Hegel doesn't seem to understand that conflict can spiral out of hand and that it can lead to a complete annihilation.
What did Hegel really say about synthesis? He didn't use that word. He used something else, right?
Abstraction, negation, and the concrete, if I'm correct. Right? So the thesis and synthesis is actually something that somebody else dumped down Hegel and turned it into that. But it's easy to remember.
Usually it's blamed on Schelling, but it's certainly not Hegel.
Yeah, it wasn't even Schelling. I think it was some, anyway.
Fichte. I think it was Fichte. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. Some bloody German.
Thesis, synthesis, and so on. And so basically what Hegel doesn't see is that if you have if you have this conflict in a tribe, this conflict spirals out of hand, and there is only one way in which you can appease it, and that is the sacred. And so this is where, so Alexander, you have to be careful with using the sacred around Girardians, right? Because the sacred for Girardians is scapegoating. It's appeasing the conflict in a tribe by killing the scapegoat. So the sacred is not a good thing for Girardians, right? So
it isn't for me either. I'm terribly neutral. You know that. I'm terribly neutral about all the terms I use. I should remind you of that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it depends on how you use it, right? Because I understand that you use it in a different way. Sacred actually means protected against the corruption from commerce, basically. But that is not how a Girardian would use this particular word. So, but just to come back to Hegel, so 2 points of criticism from Girard with respect to Hegel. So first, desire is misunderstood. Is actually, I think that Girard and Hegel are actually quite close, because it's always is desire for the desire of the other, while Girard says, well, it's you desire what somebody else desires. So there's a certain overlap there, but it's different. And the second problem is, well, Hegel doesn't seem to understand that conflict, that, let's say, the thesis and the antithesis, they can lead to conflict that can only lead to either complete annihilation or appeasement on the tribal level using the sacred, and that is by killing scapegoats, which of course in our networked society, in our post-nuclear world, if that happens on a global scale, that's the end game, right? It's game over.
Okay, now it's time for Cadel's devastating retort.
Okay. Well, I started the whole talk by saying I'm not going to go into rivalrous dynamics with you guys, so I'm not going to just give a
No, I want a mature, a discussion here. That's not what I was suggesting. I'm agreeing with you here. Yeah.
So it's hard to do these thinkers justice in a podcast format, but I'll give it my best shot. So what's well recognized by the some of the greatest Hegelian scholars of the 20th century is that the phenomenology of spirit, which is not the whole of Hegel, but it's a significant and probably one of his most important books, is designed as a series of triads. So the whole book is designed by triadic thinking. So the critique of Hegel as a dyadic thinker is, I mean, there is a two in Hegel, but there's always a third. So the critique of Hegel as thinking about desire in a dyadic way is simply foreign to me. The second thing is specifically about the way some people read the phenomenology of spirit, is that it's not clear to me that many people know how to read it, because, and it's hard to communicate how to read it. But one of the crucial things about it is that one shouldn't take the statements of the chapters, specifically the chapters running consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, and religion, as what Hegel himself thinks. They're rather attempts to describe to ordinary consciousness how they develop. So it's not exactly what Hegel thinks, but rather trying to describe the inside of phenomenological development. So, for example, if people ascribe to Hegel the universality of the master-slave dialectic or something like that, it's not something that Hegel is saying is universal. He's saying it's something that self-consciousness at a certain level has to move through or has to develop beyond, and eventually can develop beyond. Mm-hmm. The next thing, I guess, is about, I mean, Hegel does sometimes use the word thesis and antithesis, very rarely. He doesn't, at least in my reading, he's never used the word, I've never read anything from him that uses the word synthesis. What he's talking about ultimately is the concrete idea. That's usually what people refer to when they say synthesis. And the concrete idea for Hegel is never complete, or the concrete idea is never like a unified totality in which all differences are reconciled, or which all, it's all peace and harmony.
I have a question. So it's often said
Sure.
that basically that this kind of has an endpoint, right? So do you agree with that or not? That the absolute goes to a certain, what is it? The absolute knows itself, right? So there's this cosmic subject that in the end knows itself. Is that something that you agree with or not?
No. Can I fill in here? The absolute in Hegel is understanding the limits of your thinking. That there is no endpoint is the endpoint. That's the Hegelian absolute. Okay.
That's good.
Can I just fill in here? And Cadell can disagree with me if he likes, but when I say I'm a Hegelian, and any Hegelian I meet, what they always refer to is that I'm not really interested in the different theories that Hegel tried out in his own lifetime. He wasn't interested. Okay, he just basically said, this is probably how you think, right? What's fantastic about Hegel is methodology. So he creates a new onto-epistemology, basically a new way of understanding the world and how we think and must think as human beings, and actually even how the world operates that way. Our thinking is reflected in being. Thinking and being are the same for Hegel. What that means is that what is so striking when you read Phenomenology of Spirit and dig into it the first time is that, my God, it's like a trip. It's like, finally a guy who makes me think. And the reason you fall in love with Hegel is that there's no way back. There's finally a guy who gets thinking. And maybe if you dug into Aristotle or something like that 400 years ago, you would have a similar experience. He's the only thinker ever that have challenged people as deeply as Hegel did. But Hegel is so fucking concentrated. He nails it so well. So if you didn't get Aristotle, if it was there to begin with, Hegel can explain it to you, how you think. And basically the way it works is very phallic. What that means is that he's not afraid of making decisions because he knows that decisions are only temporary. So he's basically saying, why are you terrified of making decisions? What Hegel does is that he takes out his big dick and boom, makes decisions all the time. He says, okay, here are two different things. I decide I go with that one. I know it's not the end game. I know it's a temporary decision. It's likely to be a good one because I probably have enough intelligence to make a good choice. I make a choice, go down that path, and if it turns out I went down a dead end, I will soon know because I made a decision. The payback of making a decision in Hegel is that I know I reached a dead end quicker than the other guys do, so I can go back and go the other path. And you then realize that everything in the world, although it's chaotic and all that, it's all about, it has to flow in one or two directions to make a decision. You make the decision, you go down the path, and you then pursue what's abstract and see if you can make it concrete. And here's Hegel's genius. Hegel says to make the abstract concrete, so you have more of a foundation on which you make the next decision, and then make the next decision, and make the next decision, is to make this decision quickly and therefore get ahead of everybody else in your thinking and anything else you do, to be a smart guy, basically what you do is like you start with the negation. So Hegel says, instead of looking for where do you have the first signs of the next thing to happen, which any sort of fashion-oriented person would do, Hegel basically says, no, wait for the lack, wait for the void, wait for what's missing in the previous model. The crack in the previous models was interesting. And if you see the crack in the previous model, whoop, that's where you make the decision to start. Because the negation, what's lacking in the model, is exactly what can turn the abstract into the concrete. That nobody did before Hegel that I know of. If Hegel made a contribution to thinking that nobody did before, probably only Western thinker ever did that, that was Hegelian, and that came from Hegel. Let's see what could I agree or not.
It seems to be like an epistemology. This is how humans kind of, let's say, an optimal way in thinking about certain topics. And then it reminds me very much about the paradigm shifts of Thomas Kuhn, actually.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
About that.
Yes, absolutely.
Is that similar, or is that would that be?
No. Hegel even proposes a few paradigms when he does it, as I do with Söderqvist. My model is not going to last forever, but considering that data is the most important thing today, we live in a attentionalist world, I basically, with Jan Söderqvist over the last 20 years, pursued a Hegelian model so we can understand the paradigms we lived in. I used Thomas Kuhn and Hegel, precisely the two of them there, and now I add Girard to that model.
Can I make a bit of a sort of a leap, which you guys are probably going to jump all over me and say, no, which Alexander usually does. Anyway, I was thinking about how mimetic desire, right? Maybe it can't be solved by Sutra, that there's a lack in Sutra, and then maybe you need Tantra to solve mimetic desire. And there's something maybe tantric about Hegel that's close to the sort of idea in Tantra of shunyata, emptiness, void, a gap, where there's in that void, in that gap, in that space, something is created, something emerges, and the Tantrikas embrace that energy, right? That energy, whereas the Sutrianist people renounce it.
Now, I would say with Hegel, when you apply Sutra and Tantra on Hegel would just say, Tantra is essentially what you're ready for. So you must stay in the Sutra, and you must always have the Sutra as a foundation, and then you can go from the Sutra to Tantra when you're ready for it. So to apply Sutra and Tantra, which is much more fruitful with Nietzsche and Girard than it is with Hegel, but if you're going to go through that with Hegel would just say, okay, that's just a dialectical process depending on where you're at in that process. For example, how far you developed in a certain chain of thought. So Tantra is just basically saying that you're not ready to develop this yet because the dialectical process isn't there yet. So you cannot dialecticize it. And therefore, you would definitely end up in the wrong place if you go there too early. That would be Hegel's approach to the whole division of Tantra and Sutra. He would just put it along the timeline and say, Tantra is just something you might never reach. The Bard Absolute, for example. You might something, or you could reach it in your lifetime. And in that case, the history of the world in your lifetime, or you personally were ready to go into that Tantric realm, by which time you go into that realm, it becomes Sutric to you, and then you move into the next Tantra. That's all Hegel would do with Tantra and Sutra.
Well, my thing is there's emptiness, which is shunyata, which is a lack, which is a gap, which is something radical, and that's the highest point of Mahayana, of Sutra, is that insight. And
it's not the same. It's not the same thing as Hegelian negation. Let's keep that out. I want to have Cadell's response. If Cadell, like me, fell in love with Hegel by discovering the method and the thinking, or what was it that pulled Cadell into Hegel the first time? I'd love to hear that.
To be honest, I think what pulled me into Hegel was a desire to escape mimetic rivalry, now that I can only think about it in retrospect. Because I think the reason why I started studying Hegel was to make sense of the way in which my intellect was caught into games of rivalry with other great thinkers. And specifically thinkers that were very close to me personally. So I guess I found in Hegel a method, but also someone who was not just thinking about abstract theorization, but the actual spiritual process which underlies abstract theorization, and the way in which, if one really dedicates oneself to the spiritual process, that there's a qualitatively different relationship to abstraction. In other words, there's a qualitatively different relationship to mimetic rivalry, or that's one way to put it. Because the reason why, and I think there may be a difference in the sacred, if for Girard the sacred is scapegoating, and to be honest with you, in my own personal life and in my own family, there's been some scapegoating, which has probably been the most devastating event of my life in the last 2 years. I think that for Hegel, the sacred is something related to absolute knowing, and the subject of absolute knowing doesn't scapegoat, and perhaps could be scapegoated, but doesn't scapegoat, because in some sense, the subject of absolute knowing has already died, or has, the way I say it is that the subject of absolute knowing has died before death has found the subject. So like the way I think about the phenomenology of spirit is almost like it offers you a test to your own spirit. But the two options I see in the phenomenology of spirit is either you don't do the work necessary to find death before death finds you, or you do. And then if you do that, then I think there's a qualitatively different relationship to images, to abstractions, to the way you think and the way you interact with other people. So
it's a big ontological shift, like a spiritual revelation.
Yeah, it's
like
not just epistemological
or whatever.
It's not just epistemological, it's also ontological.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I do think that there's a lot of synergy and there's a lot of interesting comparisons and comparative studies that could be done necessarily between, say, what is the relationship between Hegel and Thomas Kuhn, or one of the questions I asked in my first course is, what is the relationship between Hegel's model of history and someone like a Ken Wilber and integral theory and stuff like that. And I think that it's interesting to see someone do an analysis like that. But at least in my understanding, Kuhn is talking about something epistemological, and Hegel is obviously also talking about epistemology, but also ontology. He's not merely epistemological.
I can give an example, for example, how it's useful to use Hegel in the process that Cadell and I are involved with. For example, to understand Nietzsche was a very unfinished philosopher. The problem with Nietzsche is that he was a genius and he was a great writer, but there's so much unfinished work with him. And of course, Heidegger was obsessed with trying to finish Nietzsche, which of course Heidegger never could. He was Heideggerian after all. But I give you two examples of that, two of the most famous concepts in Nietzsche philosophy, which helps to use Hegel. So take, for example, will to power. The way I work with that, Jan Söderqvist, is that I split it up into two different wills. There is no will to power. There's will to intelligence and there's will to transcendence. And they're naturally very different. And actually, they're much more fruitful to see in a dialectical relationship. We could possibly call the dialectic a will to power, because it turns out that we very often apply the will to power on different people, meaning we apply will to transcendence onto one person, usually the chief in the triad, and we apply the will to intelligence to another person, usually the priest. And that's precisely why the priest and the chief are not the same people. And that's precisely why they must not be in a rivalrous relationship with one another. Rather, you mimic them to become one of them because of a certain archetype or personality type, where you could either one day become a priest or one day become a chief, and hopefully you then compete to become that person. But they must not be in a rivalrous relationship with one another, because if they are, you either get one of them killing the other and get a tyrant, and then you go down with the tyrant, or they kill each other both, and then your whole tribe is wiped out. So by splitting will to power into will to intelligence and will to transcendence, which is a typical Hegelian move using a Nietzschean concept, we have a much better philosophy right there. The other one is to open up to more dialectical relationships. Is, for example, we've discussed, that you and I, Andrew and Thomas discussed a lot. The problem with Nietzsche is that he kind of has a vulgar dialectic between the Apollonian and Dionysian. And the deeper we looked into the Apollonian, which is this concept of some kind of social order, and a Dionysian, which is kind of moving, that he romanticizes about, and this sort of a moving, exotic mob destroys the Apollonian then returns, and there would be some kind of a dialectic between these two, which is a dyadic dialectic, that's Nietzsche. Well, it turns out that's not very Hegelian either, because if you split the Dionysian, this is the more chaotic part, if you split it into the Dionysian swarm, and then allow for the concept of a Sibelian mob, which is very much what woke culture is today, for example, then discover that when people move around in the street, they either go out in the street with frustrations and mimetic rivalry towards scapegoating, which is a Sibelian mob. But a Dionysian swarm is something that walks down the street when the Apollonian has become tyrannical and stuck, and it cannot move, and it might even kill you. You need to get the Apollonian out of the way and create a revolution that opens up the possibility for something entirely new, which is required. And that's what Nietzsche romanticized about. So we can save Nietzsche's Dionysian swarm by also allowing for a Sibelian mob, which Nietzsche never did. Again, it's really useful to throw Hegel at these guys. And what I want to do with Girard is basically say, what if we now could discuss the mimetic rivalry theory, which is fantastic, the moving out of the sort of Cain and Abel asking two individuals fighting it out, and rather look at what happens if different societies compete mimetically. What happens then, and how can we avoid that? Because I think scapegoating is now becoming a much more complex problem when the entire world is involved with it. And I think that's what we should take Girard next, is applying Hegel onto Girard to try to understand the difference between capitalism and attentionalism, and what would the attentionalist mimetic rivalry and all its horror look like. Cheers.
Well, I can chip in with something about Nietzsche, in the sense that, so Nietzsche's will to power and his ressentiment is so I think you can interpret it, and you should interpret it in two ways. So if so first of all, will to power is not only like, ruling over other people and things like that. That is a very naive and a very crude interpretation. So Nietzsche also certainly put will to power as the will to power over your own imperfections. Let's say your own destructive emotions and your basically your rivalrous nature. And the ressentiment, he also used that for the resentment of the mob, the slave mentality towards people who are more successful. So basically simple rivalry. So there I agree with Nietzsche. But Nietzsche definitely also romanticized will to power as power over other people. And he definitely also, he did not see that will to power in that sense and ressentiment are two sides of the same coin. He did not see that. And you can very clearly see it in his own life because he was extremely prone to mimetic rivalry. He went into complete mimetic rivalry with Wagner. And there are many people who think, and there's even studies on that, is that he made himself insane because he was so incredibly rivalrous, especially with respect to Wagner. So he really was obsessed with Wagner. So there you can see that you have to be very careful with Nietzsche because he's very smart. In a sense, he sees will to power not in this naive way, but basically will to power over your own imperfections and resentment as the resentment of the mob. So there I agree with Nietzsche. But the romanticize this romantic dream on powerful elites, on powerful people, and not seeing that wanting power and competing over objects with others automatically leads to resentment. He did not understand that. He didn't get that.
Okay.
And that's what Girard brings in.
Yeah, but we're not Nietzsche.
No, I'm not accusing you of being Nietzsche. But I'm pointing that out.
Yeah, I know. But mediocre people can think wonderfully anyway. And the problem here is that Girard mixes up the psychology of Nietzsche with the philosophy of Nietzsche. And I think it's banal to do that. You must separate the two. The thing here is that... No, it's very Hegelian. What I pointed out...
It's totally un-Hegelian.
Thomas, listen to me. I pointed out by separating, which Nietzsche failed to do, the Dionysian swarm from the Sabellian mob. You separate their sentiment and the will to power within the mob and the swarm itself. You cannot banally, just Girard said that, if you got a crowd in the streets, that's evil. You can't say that. That's ridiculous. You got a crowd in the street. No, but if you got a crowd in the street, you got to figure out what kind of crowd is that? And what kind of times do we live in? And what are they up against? And here is the heroic versus the resentful. And the difference between the heroic and the resentful, try to mix up the heroic and resentful, say the two sides of the same coin. It's just horrible nihilism to me. This is the actor's form of nihilism. That's saying that there cannot be any values ever in humans. And I think that's ridiculous. No, the heroic and the resentful are the foundations of ethics. And even if they're not pure, we don't say that they're very human. At the end of the day, if you work on yourself and you remove through meditation every morning when you get up, I'm a Zoroastrian, and you remove the drush as far as you possibly can to allow the ashra, meaning you allow the swarm mentality when you interact with other people rather than mob mentality. You're aware of the scapegoating mechanism. You try to minimize its possibility of arising its ugly head, and therefore you can go out with a constructive mindset that day. You can create a much more constructive world. That's precisely why civilization exists in some place of the world and doesn't exist in other places. We haven't succeeded equally, or we haven't failed equally across the world. It turns out that every culture we know of that embraces the heroic and fosters its children to stay heroic as much as they possibly can through childhood as they grow up, possibly also can embrace and take on the most challenging things in their life, for example, tantric culture. Tantra is impossible in a resentful culture. A culture that only has scapegoating mechanism, nothing else, a pagan culture cannot have a tantra at all. Tantra requires, for example, advanced thinking requires you must stay with a heroic mindset and afford to be in a heroic mindset at all. So the basics of all values of ethics in Hegel and Nietzsche are equal. The basics for ethics itself is to stay with and work towards the heroic and see the heroic as our goal and set it up. You got a heroic, it's higher than you, it's in front of you, you try to reach the heroic. You try to put other people with you, your own network or your own tribe with you to go towards the heroic. Now, that is what religion at its best tries to do. It tries to get as many people as possible to strive for that. Now, wait a second. So that is fundamental. So to say that will to power and resentment are the two sides of the same coin, maybe that's the case with Nietzsche. I don't think so, but let's
this is where we disagree. This is where we completely...
Wait. But that was interesting, not Nietzsche. What's interesting is us. What's interesting is us here. What's interesting what we do with these things. And precisely by separating within the mob from the swarm, we have the possibility to find something constructive and something destructive and make them different from one another.
Well, I was thinking the heroic is going outwards, yeah, as you say, towards something greater, whatever. It's also the fact that you change your attention inwards. And that's meditation. That's another aspect of the heroic, which is how I deal with the scapegoat, with mimetic rivalry, is through meditation. Maybe Cadell deals with that through concepts, like in the Hindu tradition, they call that jnana yoga. You just work on concepts until you arrive at some kind of absolute knowing through concepts. But my way of doing that is like meditation is dissolving concepts. So, and I think that's a way of dealing with the mimetic thing as much as the outward. There's the outward and the inward movement. So I don't know if that makes sense to anybody or anybody wants to comment.
I think that's Girard's point. I mean, Girard works with enlightenment, and Girard obviously wants us to all contemplate on the scapegoat mechanism, thinking the scapegoat mechanism is the most terrifying thing we have in our society, and we need to constantly work with it. And I don't see any other approach than the very pragmatic one of working with it every day.
Yeah, because that is the most terrifying thing, right? I mean, there's nothing more terrifying about humanity than the fact that we create scapegoats. I mean, and we've engaged in human sacrifice since the beginning of time, and that's kind of.
Oh, I mean,
and then also the most terrifying thing is that we have that within ourselves. And that's the Jungian shadow. You don't mind me bringing Jung in, but which is pure evil, right?
Yeah, but my point is here is that we know that already. That's capitalism and memetic theory. So I want to go to attentionalism and memetic theory. For example, Iran and Israel right now. If Iran is building the bomb. Obviously, they're doing it. It doesn't seem like Biden can stop them from doing it. It doesn't even make much of an effort. And Iran has Israel as a scapegoat. Israel has Iran as a scapegoat. They try to bring the rest of the world with them. And if the Soviet Union and the United States then blow each other up with atomic bombs, these guys will at least locally probably try to do so quite soon. So, okay, atomic bombs is a way bigger threat than climate change, whatever you think about it. So if you talk about like a threat to human extinction, things like that, then we created nuclear weapons. Since August the 6th, 1945, we live in an entirely new era. We can blow ourselves up. And this is precisely why Girard writes about the scapegoat mechanism, why it's so urgent in the times we live in. I don't think of any more obvious reason than that. But the thing is that we talk about scapegoat mechanism here is no longer a small tribe. It's not just two guys fighting it out over something and one guy becoming the scapegoat. The scapegoat mechanism is that the tribe can just kill this innocent guy, get rid of him, and we have peace for a few more months until we blow each other up again. No, this is on a much more existential level. It's global level now, because we now live in a completely globalized world because of the internet. And that's precisely why I want to take Girard and throw him and McLuhan into the internet age, and then start looking at what does it mean with attentionalism and all the different rivalries that is going to create worse than ever. We'll have a stronger class structure than ever. This is an attentionalist class structure. I mean, to have 124,000 followers on Twitter or have 11 people who care about you is a totally different game altogether, right? So these things will now start exploding. And what we're seeing right now is the beginning of that, with all these accusations between subcultures, and warfare between subcultures, cyber warfare is exploding, is basically preparing us for something much bigger that's about to happen. And one thing right now is that nobody's in control of this. I mean, there is no big other in charge. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. Yeah. And these are the mechanisms we deal with in the 21st century. It's the same
on the microcosmic level as on the macrocosmic level in bigger groups as it is with the individual. So it's the same thing. Just on a larger scale.
So basically we had religion to kind of keep things in track, right? So we had religion that said, so we started with paganism. That was basically, so you regularly have conflict in the tribe or in the society, not only in tribes. Let's say the Roman Empire, Greek civilization, they were pagan civilization, so they regularly killed people to appease the conflict in the community, right? So you had this mechanism that was based on religion, and that appeased conflict in society. Then Christianity that kind of started dismantling this. So it started to expose the scapegoat mechanism, and it became it doesn't work that much anymore. It doesn't work anymore because nobody believes anymore in the complete guilt of the scapegoat. So that mechanism, and that mechanism that works, right? You can actually appease societies using that mechanism, but that stopped working. So we can't do that anymore. So then we had for a couple of 100 years. So let's say after the Peace of Westphalia, after the 30-year war between the Catholics and the Protestants, right? Then politics took over, because then suddenly your religion was your personal affair, or basically the affair of the person who was in charge of you, right? The prince or the king or the duke or whatever. So people started agreeing, okay, good, religion, that is a personal matter. So then we had like an era of politics that took over, and politics tried to kind of keep all the scapegoating and all this escalation in society. So politics tried to kind of keep that under control. And then let's say from the beginning of the 20th century, we had capitalism that took over. And capitalism is very, very simple, right? How do you get rid of envy and jealousy in society? You just flood everybody with goods. You just flood everybody with a lot of stuff, so at least people are not envious and jealous about things they can buy, right? People just, you're not going to kill each other over a watch. You just go out and buy it, right? So, but that also seems to come to an end. So this just flooding everybody with things, this doesn't work anymore, because the planet cannot sustain it anymore. If you just look around, now we have nuclear weapons, we have a lot of tensions in society. So it seems that also capitalism is coming at an end now. And then the question is, what's next? And there's no real answer coming, right? So if you read Battling to the End, the last book of Girard, he describes all of this, but there's no clear solution.
I think you need to look deeper, but my response to that is that I think the religions of centralization did their job the way you described, and I think they're done. I think politics is also religion. Politics is just ideology. It's just another form of religion. It's just ideology anyway. Religion is ideology too. I don't think it's that different. It's different narratives we're talking about here. I hate to be existentialist, you know that, but I think Andrew's onto it. I think it is the daily pursuit of the Asha versus Druj mentality. It's the daily pursuit of the heroic versus the victimhood mentality that is absolutely essential here. And I think that's exactly why we react so strongly against woke culture today, because we know that's wrong. We know woke culture, we don't moralize against it. We know woke culture is underclass. We know woke culture is a loser's game. We know the people who play the woke game, they're the last to run into the old paradigm. They come from politics. They come from mass media. They come from old industry. They come from advertising. That's why we have woke today. So they've taken over the old institutions before those institutions are dying, and they're desperate to scream from those positions. Why? Because they failed online. They were promised the world. The internet came along in the 1990s. Everybody would be a star. Everybody was promised success. And 99% failed, because we can only have that many talents on the stage. We don't want everybody's story. At the 18th century, when every concubine in Europe wrote about how she could get to fuck the king, we got so fucking tired of the concubines. We started having a book publishing industry that finally could get rid of all the mediocrity that human beings produce all the time, all the fucking junk they produce, all the spam they produce. And it's the same thing now. All these junksters and all these spamsters we had around us are now disappointed. They're deeply disappointed because they were promised the world and not even their mom or their dad cared. And the world is full of them in the 2020s. They're all over the place. So they're filling up psychiatric care institutions. They want the antidepressants. They want the happiness pills because they didn't get all the famous celebrity they were promised. But they played an old game. Nobody wants to be a fame or celebrity any longer because that whole game's dead. You want to be inside a really cool network of things that really are creative, that get the best out of you, and you want to be in a constructive mindset within that network. Mm-hmm. And I think the key here is to go to the trade route religions. I believe Buddhism is a good place to go. I think Zoroastrianism is a good place to go. I think Taoism is a good place to go. I think if you happen to be born a Jew, you're probably in a good place too. But I think the religions that didn't strive towards building the Rome or the Mecca, the religions that didn't strive towards building the centrality of ideology or a communist paradigm. I think it is the trade route religions that work from the perspective of decentralization. They didn't promise you the world. They didn't promise you resurrection. They didn't promise you reincarnation. They promised you die when you die, And all you can do during your life is to give birth to children, pass on everything before the day you die. And before you die, just be a good role model who doesn't envy other people, who doesn't go rubbish to other people, who just gets up in the morning, does your meditation properly with a constructive mindset. In every little pragmatic thing you do every day of your life, you try to deconstruct it.
Well, you talk about attentionalism as an outward activity, like, you know, what you, but I keep thinking of it as like meditation itself. In other words, you're changing the orientation of your attention. And that is the way out of mimetic rivalry, and that's also the way out of capitalism, I think. I mean, that's how I see it. And I also have this insight that Sutra, right, is we've all agreed that Sutra is a necessary base for tantra, and we need Sutra, and we need this Sutra base to everything. But I also think that Sutra is limited, and Christianity might be limited, and that Sutric religion might be limited in terms of the intense energies that are needed to deal with whatever's coming next. So I agree with you in that sense of these being found in the small schools, the small, you know, schools of which are less, let's say, universalist in their methodologies. Yeah,
the most terrible thing that could happen today is that the Islamic and the Christian apocalyptists get it. And they finally get what they wanted, which is the Armageddon between Islam and Christianity through atomic bombs. It's a very likely scenario. But I think it disqualifies both Islam and Christianity fundamentally from a serious discussion about the future. Because they're apocalyptic religions, they all believe the world will go down. That's exactly what they're exploitative. And they believe the New Jerusalem is going to come along. It's fundamental to those two religions. And I think a religion that doesn't embrace death fully and accept death fully to the core is not a religion worth pursuing any longer. We have to start with death. We have to start with the complete and acceptance of absolute death. You die when you die. And I don't think any other religion that tries anything else is credible any longer, because we cannot believe it. I think that, if anything, is where we need to start today.
But what you just described are the pagan elements. These are pagan elements that are loose in the world. You can find them in every religion. You can find them in Islam, in Christianity. You can find them in the East. These are the pagan elements of religion. The elements that are out for mob formation and scapegoating, and you can find these everywhere. You can find these even in religions that have that at the core are even reactions against
Of course,
that's where I don't agree.
Tom, no, you're mixing up psychology and philosophy again. I'm not interested
I'm not a philosopher. I'm not even interested in philosophy. I try to understand things.
Well, then you have to include philosophy in your understanding. Otherwise, you don't mean what you said. So the reason is this: any religion that just practically, pragmatically pursues a life towards death, which pursues
That's a pagan religion.
No, it's not.
Can
I finish? Shut up.
Paganism.
You're not funny, Tom.
I think we need to bring in.
No, wait.
I agree.
Wait a second. Any religion that pursues the heroic in everyday life is one that's worth pursuing towards death. And that I mean fundamentally, and I disqualify any other religion right now. I think that's the only thing we can afford. We have to start there. It's not paganism at all. You're mixing up the thing. Paganism goes towards the scapegoat mechanism, releases, and then goes back to scapegoat mechanism. It's the eternal return of the saint. Paganism is tied to reincarnation. Paganism is not towards absolute death. Paganism lies all the time and said, no, there's another life coming, another life coming. You're being reborn all the time. You're being reborn higher or lower in the hierarchy, you're being reborn. Buddhism tried to get out of that, but basically going towards moksha instead. But at the end of the day, if you don't accept absolute death and work towards absolute death, which the trade route religions do and always did, you're lost.
Cadell, do you have any insights here to help us with this sort of? I feel like we're at an impasse here in your points of view, and maybe we could add some fresh insights here.
Well, I mean, I do think one of the tendencies in the human spirit is to avoid confrontation with death as something that's very personal. Death is something very strange, I always thought, because death is something that is both simultaneously universal and something very personal. I mean, you have to die. And it's something that in some sense authentically unites us beyond an image, because every human that ever existed has died. And yet it's very strange, the persistence of the image of immortality. So for me, when I was younger, I was fascinated with transhumanism, which I think in the early 20th century was something of a scientific religion where the idea of immortality emerged internal to, let's say, scientific rationality. The idea that you're going to be uploading into a computer, or you're going to, through some technological manipulation of your body, be able to extend your life indefinitely or enhance, they have concepts like radical life extension and radical life expansion. So in the end, where I've come to on things like that is simply and largely through personal conflicts, I suppose, and seeing the way in which people who avoid death in life end up, to use a metaphor that Alex Ebert uses frequently, become like a cancerous cell. Like they start wreaking havoc on their environment. I do think it's in, at least on a personal level, confronting one's own mortality and one's own finitude, where one can start to speak and interact from a place of actual wisdom and knowing. But in terms of building out a new religion, or building out whatever would be a religious layer of our society, I mean, I grew up in a very atheistic culture, or a secular culture. I don't know what practical steps would need to be taken to actually have a new religious layer. Would it resemble the religions of the past? Would it be like a trade route religion? Would it be something completely new? I have no idea. I mean, in my practical life, I just have to stay very close to my body and stay close to my life. And what I see people's religions as today are screens. I was saying that to my partner today. Our religion today is the religion of the screen. We're all addicted to screens. We're all attached to screens. We're nonstop looking at screens. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. Will there be some sort of qualitative transition in relationship between our minds and the computers and the screens we're using? Will that somehow involve a religious dimension? I'm not sure. But
Maybe
I think
McLuhan is good to bring in here. McLuhan, I was thinking, Alexander mentioned McLuhan, and I wanted to bring McLuhan in. But sorry.
I think it's important here to make a distinction between the timeless quality, what it means to be human, and the time-specific quality. If you do paradigmatics, which I think is the only way you can do ethics, you have to separate between those two. When it comes to the most human aspect here, the heroic versus the resentful is the foundation for all proper ethics. And certainly for ethics today, it's the only thing we got left. And that means the group as a whole has to try to go heroic. And we can discuss heroism. I think Ebert has interesting ideas. Maybe Thomas Hamelryck does too. I don't know. But the different types of heroes, and essentially the heroic in a timeless sense, is that the real role model you look up to, the real heroic role model you look up to, is not somebody who runs around being resentful and hating everybody else because they got something you didn't have. That's not a role model you want. No, it isn't. The role model you want is rather somebody who, to the tribe, contributes to the tribe way more than he or she would ever have to need for themselves, because they're strong enough to be able to do that. So they can, on top of everything they do, usually in the masculine sense, we call it a person who creates an abundance. And the feminine sense, we call it a person who can apply generosity to the community. And all the sort of saints we've got in religion, and the forefathers in worship and forefather worship, etc., and ideas we have of gods and things like that, that are role models for us, the lesser gods, as we call them in theology, all of them have these qualities. They're heroic. So it's not like we have to, so what does heroism mean? It's not like somebody hasn't thought about that for the past 10,000 years. Rather, to make a distinction between the heroism and the victimhood mentality is essential here, because the victimhood mentality in a group will undoubtedly lead to civilian mob, will release the scapegoat mechanism, and will lead to bloodshed instantly, right? Whereas if you go towards heroic mode and you make the heroic manages to become network dynamical and social, and if you have a social heroic mode, then you can change the world. The Dionysian swarm can take over the world, invent new technologies, invent new ideas and things like that. And you could actually then improve on civilization and certainly at least save it, what I think is required. They definitely difference. I'm a strong advocate of ethics. I'm a strong advocate of paradigmatics. I am not a cynical nihilist. And I refuse to read Réne Girard as a cynical nihilist. And certainly Hegel and Nietzsche were not cynical nihilists. They thought cynical nihilism was banal. They thought it was the end of the game, but they also thought that opened up to the affirmation of the new. That's where Hegel and Nietzsche strongly agreed. Why would they else write books?
I don't think Nietzsche was a cynical nihilist, but Nietzsche
no, he wasn't.
Actually showcases very well that even somebody who is a genius, who really is on top of things, one of the best psychologists that ever lived, because he was actually the first one who described the scapegoat mechanism, and Girard gives him credit for that. And even Nietzsche went completely to pieces over envy and jealousy. That's my point. You can kind of say,
I disagree.
Okay, I'm heroic. We're heroic.
Strongly.
Well, what guarantee do you have that you understand what you're doing? You don't.
You read one book by O'Gurlian about Nietzsche where he argues that Nietzsche envied Wagner. Nietzsche broke with Wagner. I've read fucking Nietzsche's life story. I strongly disagree with your vulgarized idea of Nietzsche. And I'm not even defending Nietzsche psychologically because I think it's not even interesting. I think Nietzsche, the philosopher, is way more interesting than his psychology. I think it's banal.
Let's move on
for their
from this
psychology.
particular topic.
It doesn't have any value to the arguments in his books.
I want to know why Cadell thinks screens are a religion. Like, what do you mean by that?
I think it's when I observe humans, that's where their attention is.
Attention is religion, in other words.
Well,
what you put your attention on, completely or something like that would be your religious occupation. What you meditate on is you, basically, or something like that.
All I'm saying is that when I observe humans and I observe where their attention is, it's on screens, and it's hard for me to know what the future of religion will be like or could be like. I mean, I don't go to like Sunday mass. I'm not a part of a religious community. I'm very much just an individual living most of his social life in the context of the internet. I mean, most of my social interactions are via email or Zoom, or I mean, most of our social environments are radically I don't know what to say, like on various forms of lockdown and shutdown.
Is that a complaint about the human nature, or is it just an observation, like a neutral observation?
It's just an observation.
Okay.
That's where our attention is. Our attention's on screens. And I think that most of people right now are getting like the emotional highs or the emotional kicks that they would have gotten from being in a tribe in the past, from
like worshiping or something,
getting a like or getting recognized on a social media platform, or just zoning out and watching YouTube, or just zoning out and watching some social media platform. So I think that's where our attention is, and capitalism tries to invade that space, but it doesn't. I mean, I'm hesitant to say that, there are a lot of social theorists that say we're in a stage of late capitalism, or that capitalism's ending.
Mm-hmm.
But it's easy to find statements of people saying that throughout the last 2 centuries as well. Like there have been people throughout the 2 centuries who've said that capitalism's towards its end and that capitalism's almost over. But I mean, capitalism also reinvents itself. It could be that capitalism's close to an end, but at the same time, the large majority of humanity is regulated by by capital.
Yeah, and I was thinking that advertisement, almost everybody's become an advertisement for themselves. Like advertisement has become particularized to every single person. Like Alexander was criticizing, saying advertising was over also. I mean, I kind of get his point as well, but. Mm-hmm. So why did you want to bring McLuhan into the story, Alexander? You mentioned that earlier, and I love McLuhan. So where does he fit in this whole story?
I'm not sure he fits into the whole story. I think adding another element here is not the right. I want to go back to the topic itself. I want to go back to capitalism, attentionalism, and memetic theory. And I think to go back to what Thomas advocates here is that, can we start using Girard here now on a larger scale? So Girard is right historically about paganism. And if paganism now returns, especially in a nihilistic society that tends to be secular, because I think a secular so-called atheist society is precisely one that is completely open to a pagan revival. It doesn't have a defense mechanism against paganism. I think Thomas agrees with me on that one. Mm-hmm. I found that far more interesting constructed to go down that path. And I think if attentionalism means that if we can't afford to, we no longer allow ourselves, our ears and our eyes to be bought. We don't watch BAM. We pay to avoid commercials on YouTube. We pay Spotify premium so we don't have to go into the ads and all that. We get the spam out of the way, we get the ads out of the way. We think Google has gone tired. Google search is worse than it was 10 years ago. It's an open race to who comes along with the best algorithm now. And I think with algorithms are tied to blockchains, we've got a revolution ahead of us. I think we can safely predict that the real coin here is algorithm and blockchain. If that happens in the next 10 years, it's going to revolutionize the world. Now, if that happens, and we sort of get what we were looking for, we're going to get a lot more honest view of the world and ourselves, which we're not prepared for. And I think if we, on a massive scale, have gone towards something way more secular and nihilistic, and then we get this kind of big truth thrown at us through algorithms and blockchains, I think we're going to lock ourselves instantly into gated communities if we can. We're certainly going to lock ourselves into these little echo chambers we created the last 10 years, and we're going to go back into the echo chambers more than ever. We're going to start attacking wildly outside of the echo chambers. And if the echo chambers meet, which they will have to sooner or later, we live on the same planet in the same world, it will lead to warfare. It will lead to conflict on a massive scale. And even if it's just a global guerrilla warfare and the atomic bombs aren't even turned on, it'll still be very, very, very messy and apocalyptic. And right now, I'm not seeing anybody out there who's aware enough and can do the long path required to avoid that. But I think the trade route religions are the only I could find, and precisely by creating a paradigmatics for the internet age, based on that the heroic is something timeless we must now pursue, and that's maybe where McLuhan gets interesting. How would McLuhan say we could be heroic? He was certainly very Nietzschean in that sense. How could he claim it could be heroic when we're online in front of the screens that Cadell was talking about? What does it mean to be heroic in front of the screens, rather than just sit idly by and then start hating yourself with just scrolling and consuming things you're not even involved with, you're not even engaged with, and you end up at the bottom of the whole heap? Because if you end up at the bottom of the whole heap, you're going to use your only energy left to run in the lynch mob after the scapegoat as soon as you get a chance to do it. That's deeply human, right? Let's see if we can go there.
Great. So how to be heroic, when the medium is a message, and the medium we're all using is this, are these screens.
Yeah, I think, again, now we're reaching a crucial point, right? I mean, I could agree with this being heroic. I'm not against that, but we need to examine what does that mean? What does that mean, being heroic? Napoleon thought he was heroic. That didn't really end well, for nobody. So what's heroic? How can we be heroic? How can we be heroic in this hyper-networked time where everybody's sitting in front of a screen? What does that mean? That's a very good point. That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we be heroic without creating more envy and more jealousy and more rivalry and escalation to extremes? Because that's very, very easy to do, right? Good intentions are not good enough anymore. Good intentions often lead to explosions. You can see that in revolutions. Often revolutions are done by people who have very good intentions. and then it ends up in bloodshed, right? It ends up in a complete bloodbath. And that's where I am a bit critical of this Hegelian idea of, oh, the opposites, they will, okay, that might be a complete misreading of Hegel, right? But again, maybe I'm just talking about certain Hegelians, right? Maybe not Hegel himself, but Hegelians seem to have this optimistic idea that, oh, let's just create some opposites and then things will fall into place, because the opposites, they will go from the abstract to the negation to the concrete, and we will get something better. But what if it all just blows up? That's where I'm kind of a bit like struggling with Hegel, right? Or with the way in which Hegel can be misinterpreted, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree on that one. That is the misinterpretation of Hegel. What Hegel basically says, this is the only way you can think, and this is how you properly think. It doesn't mean you get the solution. It doesn't mean there is a solution to begin with. History isn't given beforehand. History is contingent with Hegel. Hegel is nothing but a determinist. There's nothing deterministic about Hegel at all. This is just how you deal with contingency. And by dealing with contingency and accepting history as it is, once something has happened, it's happened. Nietzsche calls that amor fati. They strongly agree on that. The affirmation in Nietzsche and the contingency that can be dealt with in Hegel, but they're not cynical. And they're not cynical precisely because they say that it is possible, judging from the intelligence of the past, by claiming that the past is a necessity in Hegel, that you could embrace a contingency and try to deal with it. All you can do is to make the attempt. Hegel doesn't say that anything is given beforehand. He doesn't say that there are solutions to that. That's precisely why the utopianism that came after Hegel was the vulgar Hegelianism. And what's interesting to study is that along the trade routes, you never had utopianism, and you also didn't have dystopianism, because they're actually, that's bad. Bad dialectics leads to utopianism and dystopianism. They lead to that. And then they argue it out with one another. Like, they argue about it. What we should do is to basically say that we negate them both. Utopianism and dystopianism are dependent. The answer we got for that is protopianism, because the only improvements we could ever make, and they're fundamentally technological, they're not really spiritual, The only improvements we could ever make are tiny, tiny, tiny incremental improvements over time. By basically accumulating knowledge of what we did in the past, and based on what we already know, maybe try something new. That's all you can do. That's the proper dialectical process. There's no utopianism in Hegel at all. Mm-hmm. That's also why Hegel doesn't have to be dystopian, because dystopian is basically just the envy of the utopian. And at least when you get to tantric religion, the first thing you must throw out before you go tantric is any idea of the utopian or the dystopian.
And that's amor fati, right? That, again, as you say, that is the heroic, and that's the acceptance of the situation as it is, which is not which is not dystopian or utopian. It's amor fati.
That's half the rock. You're right. That's half the rock. That's the will to intelligence. The will to intelligence starts with acceptance of everything as it has happened, and don't try to change that. This is story. History is a necessity, and it's a fact. Necessity in Hegel, it's a fact in Nietzsche. They agree. So that's half of the heroic.
Yeah. Find
out how the world works. Find out how the world, it's Tao in Taoism. Well, all the trade religions said that. Find out how the world works. Then, on top of that, experiment and try the best you can to stay on the constructive side of things, and then try to improve on the world. And that improvement can only ever at best be incremental, small, a small little optimization that you might be able to achieve before you die. But that's the best you can hope for, and we call that protopianism. And the protopianism says that both utopianism and dystopianism are dead wrong. We know it now from history. Throw them both out. All we can do is the protopian, tiny incremental improvement of processes. And that is basically a technological thing.
And I would
changing
add,
ourselves, I don't think we can hope for.
I would add, it's like knowing where you are. Like, are you in the desert, or are you on the mountain, or are you, closer to the city of God in the Exodus? Like, I think right now we're in the desert. So the heroicism that's required has to be related to the niche that we're in. So it has to be, it's a certain kind of heroicism. It might be the heroicism of Moses instead of the heroicism of another kind of figure. But I locate it in the religious figures rather than, that's where I see heroicism as it's most fully expressed.
What I think heroicism should strive for is to first confront absolute death. I hope Cadell agrees with me here. And if it first accepts absolute death and you're a mortal human being, you get a much more realistic horizon for your own life. That includes your own community. It also has a death date. It might be beyond your own death, but it also has a death date. It has an extinction date. It has a date when it's overdone with. So does humanity at the end of the day, right? And it's in front of that possible date that we throw ourselves to, and then we throw ourselves back. We create our values. And those values are then paradigmatic. What kind of age do I live in? I think if I am a cynical nihilist, and if I read, say, Girard as a cynical nihilist, if I would allow myself to do that, I do it to the extent that I don't think human beings can ever be improved on. Never. At least not yet. We have never improved on ourselves. In that sense, we're still taken. All we can do is to create technologies that contain us. And those technologies include narratives that contain us. So once you've got a technology and a narrative that can contain the scapegoat mechanism, so it doesn't explode in our faces all the time, or the atomic bombs or whatever, then maybe you could save humanity for a little longer. And it's the little longer that makes me an affirmative nihilist rather than a cynical one.
So I think I want to open it to questions, because we have a lot of people here. We have a big crowd, so that might add something to this conversation. I also want to hear, because Cadell, you've been very quiet, and I keep trying to pull you in here to see if you have any remarks on what have been said in the last few minutes.
Let's open it up.
Okay. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Do you want to write them in the chat? You want to unmute yourself and just ask them? You can click on the like hand icon if you want, or do we have any questions in the chat? We have kind of a conversation going on in the chat. Madeline Machado raised. Where are you, Madeline?
Hi.
Can you unmute yourself? Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've been following your conversations because, the screen is the new religion. And I happen to really find this extraordinary that we can even have these conversations. I mean, we're entering into a kind of possibility of articulation that is in real time and between, not something that goes back to one limited view of the hero, which was the lone hero. Okay. And I have to say, Alexander, I'm always very excited when you bring in your experience as an anthropologist in referring to other cultures that you've experienced firsthand and that have been ignored and neglected, over a hegemonic, universal dystopia or utopia, whichever, but certainly not pluriversal. Okay. And, in my mind, I don't know if you've become familiar with him, but in my mind, I was having a conversation seeing a conversation between you and Tyson Comporta. I think it would be absolutely wonderful.
Oh, yeah, that would be great.
I think that should be next. I mean, we've missed out because we live in a militarized prosperity bubble that has largely diminished the requisite variety for there to be new ontological formulations beyond. I mean, I'm sorry, but somebody like Hegel totally dismissed Africa. I mean, no culture, no history, that's nothing. I mean, okay, they didn't know that they had enough of the same DNA, 40% of it as a banana. So their sense of humor and their sense of identity could not be otherwise. But we don't have that excuse. I mean, we're interdependent living systems. And not to go all ecological here, but it's about building relationships. I feel that that's what you're talking about all the time. I feel like that's what you exemplify, especially you and Andrew. I mean, in your conversations, you're building a relationship that we get to participate in. And yet we keep going back to this notion of the one, you know, as if that is our reality when we're 75 trillion cells. I mean, what kind of control are we really talking about? So call me the old lady who bats around. You know, I know you've talked about that. You know, you don't want to be behind the old lady, you know, who bats around, but I'm being the old lady who bats around. So thank you.
If I can respond to the Madalena, thank you for being such a generous matriarch. That's what you are. Generosity is certainly your personality trait, more than I agree with you. And this is why I'm very, very careful to point out to people that I'm a Hegelian in the sense that Hegel made me think, right? I'm a Zoroastrian in the sense that Zoroaster made me think. And I'll tell you, Zoroaster was less embarrassing than Hegel, right? Now, if you read what Hegel then actually wrote, read them literally, that's one of the traps with Hegel. The other trap of Hegel, of course, is that you start to imply things to Hegel which he didn't write. For example, this idea of a vulgarized dialectic. So don't read Hegel's specific examples. He almost warns us about that himself. And I think Science of Logic, coming after Phenomenology of Spirit, Cadell's going to pursue it later this spring, could be really, really interesting in that sense. What he basically just says that is that this is the dialectics work, and this is basically what thinking is. And that applies to Africa, it applies to New Guinea, it applies to anywhere else. And what I found interesting was that when I started studying Eastern philosophy properly and learned Sanskrit and Avesta, went through the Persian, Chinese, Indian traditions, I discovered that most of thinking that the West seemed to think it thought had been thought before. It didn't start with the Greeks. The Greeks just collected a few books at the end of civilization. They thought anything north of them were barbarians to begin with. And then in the 1820s, when the Greeks fought the Turks, they came up with this idea that the Greeks were noble and the Turks were Oriental or whatever. And because the Greeks were noble and Turks were Oriental, Europe was invented in hindsight, and therefore Europe was the cradle of civilization. Europe was just lucky to get a fucking cannon boat and a printing press. It's nothing more than that. I'd say that Europe is at best a small little tiny extinction in recent history of the Middle East. And to me, rather, the history of Eurasia is the one of East and West along the Gobi Desert. And this is why in Zoroaster, for example, when I converted Zoroastrianism, and I could have converted to Taoism or Buddhism, and I highly respect Thomas's and Andrew's choices to go on the Buddhist path, because I think it's along the trade routes we have the only religions that are credible today, and they all come from the East. Dialectic starts with Heraclitus in Greece. He learned it, he was a Persian, he was a Kurd himself. So the dialectical process that we attribute to Hegel, although Hegel refined it, I must say that that's a good thing with Hegel. What Hegel refined started in Persia, and it existed in India and China for thousands of years. And then once you've done that, I know Cadell, for example, is going to go on a personal pursuit, digging into African thinking and African culture and African philosophy. He's on fire about it, and so am I. And maybe before I die, I get a taste more of Africa as well. I think right now we need to include the entire globe. And I think the enemy today, as always, is Gnosticism, in the sense that it's not even about mimetic desire and rivalry. It's even worse. It's the guy who doesn't have the body but thinks he's got the mind. The pillar saint, who envies the guy who's got the body. It's the guy who's got the body but doesn't have much of a mind, the boy pharaoh. It was always the boy pharaohs and pillar saints of history that caused havoc. But the guys who managed to get the priest and the chief to respect each other, and then before the matriarch deliver on their promises, which is fundamentally tribal, fundamentally human, that's civilization. And civilization is only in the multitude itself. The world is a world of interdependencies. Radically so. And to think the world any differently cannot be thought. And that's how I read Hegel. Yeah. I certainly read Deleuze, I certainly read Spinoza, I certainly read Leibniz that way too. I think when we read these philosophers, they try to apply them on the world today, and when we crush them in particle accelerators against African and Asian and South American cultures, all we can do when we come out of that is basically accept this enormous multitude of ideas. And the dialectical process is the only reconciliation. We can agree on something in that process. That's the strength of dialectics. For me, it's a global phenomenon, dialectics. It's not a Hegelian.
Go ahead, Madeline.
I think your understanding, or your from what I've heard and read of you, your take on dialectics is very unique, Alexander. I don't think I think it's your particular, almost somatic mix. I mean, because you come from an experience of your body, number one, which is not true for a lot of thinkers today. I mean, because of what you did, because of being in music, because of being, I mean, that's a completely different trajectory. And you've been analyzing the interdependence and the interrelationships since the beginning of the web, before any philosophers were even starting to really think about it. I mean, McLuhan, yes, but you did it from a sense of an understanding of quote unquote popular culture. And that, you know, I think there's very few who have the humor, because this is the piece that I think is missing again and again. Because, I mean, if you go Spinoza on this, you know, joy is that which increases your capacity to think and act. Everything else are sad passions and the tyrants of sadness. And if we just understand, have an adequate understanding of our conditions of bondage, you know, we can start, you know, to do those particulars that William Blake is talking about, you know, the minute particulars. But I think for me, and I'm going to throw something crazy out here, because I lived in Boston, but I moved to a small village in the south of Portugal, in the Algarve, very small fishing village. And it is very global in the sense that all sorts of people have wandered in here. And now with COVID, there's all these digital nomads. And I sort of feel the pulse of what you're describing, honestly, but on the ground, not on the screen. It's here. And the name of the village is Borgau. And Borgau is actually a marine snail. That's what it is. And I started to just say, okay, I want to understand what it is that this name means if I'm living here. And it turns out that a marine snail lives between tides. So there's these limits set there. But in order to escape predators, it has to expose itself and be on the rock, attached to retain humidity. I mean, there's just so many lessons right there, you know, and I'm just sort of exploring this interspecies thing, not in some huggy sense, but our imagination, I feel, is just so limited when it comes to the possibilities. I mean, like cuttlefish, they mutate. I mean, identity politics with the cuttlefish, forget it. They are what they have to be in that moment, you know. And I'm just wondering whether, if we can create this way of relating and grounding and landing in a place, in this case, it's a seaside village, that we can start to evoke, it's not a religion, but it is the interdependence, the realization that we have so much more to draw from than these quote unquote humanist. You know, I mean, of course, Deleuze was already doing that and following Bateson. And I heard that you wanted to talk to Nora Bateson after her development strategies. And I would love to see the two of you talk about this, honestly. I don't know if she'll say yes, because people don't see you the way I do, I think.
No, Nora is my neighbor in Stockholm already, friends, Madalena. You will have me knocking your door in Portugal really soon.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I will. I will have to.
I want to say that I hope.
Invited,
sorry,
all of you.
Excuse me. You're great, Madeline. I think you're an ecstatic personality, and you're really welcome here. And I really appreciate your input. And I think I want to also say that I'd love to have Alexander and Tyson have a conversation, because I really thought his book was a knockout. I don't know if you've read it yet, Alexander, but it's an awesome and really unexpected book. So. And I hope we can do that.
He and his partner with a group at Deakin are doing something which I think is unimaginable. It's directly coding from indigenous languages into AI.
Yeah. He's an artist.
I mean, yeah. So, I mean, that would be I mean, like they tried and they failed, many experiments, but one of them was taking the marriage laws of the Aboriginal tradition and trying to put it into AI. And they said, I'm glad it was a failure, but it was an interesting experiment. Anyway, I'll leave time.
Okay, John Ager has had his hand up for a while. John, do you want to jump in here?
Hey, fellas. Yeah, I'm really tickled by the idea of like the heroic versus the resentful, and how to apply it to the digital space. And you earlier touched upon this, and I didn't really hear an idea of what is an example of heroism in the digital space. I'm really trying to think of stuff because I think we do need a lot of that now. So what could that be like?
I could say John Agner, heroic. I've worked with you now for several years in men's work, especially in Northern Europe, and I always return to you as a very, very stable foundation within that movement. You personify a stable foundation. There's something very parental about you when you embrace other brothers, and I don't see any envy in you. I don't see any dark sides. You've dealt with that. You've thrown that out, and you're totally devoted to your work, and you optimize your capacity in that work. That's what being heroic is. I think Madalena mentioned something really interesting we must not forget about. We must understand that prior to Hegel and Nietzsche is Spinoza. And Spinoza is very, very adamant about this when he talks about joy. And it doesn't mean joy in the traditional English sense at all. You must study Latin to understand Spinoza. Once you dig into Spinoza's mindset, and his mindset is originally Moorish Sufi. It's like he took Moorish Sufism to Europe, which was incredibly needed when Spinoza came along. And he just pursued his philosophical project, which is very misunderstood because it's often determined. People often talk about determinism. That's completely misunderstanding. And he's a transdeterminist, exactly the way I am. Spinoza is a fantastic philosopher. You must study in parallel with Hegel and Nietzsche, on a par with those guys. And I think also, you cannot come out of Spinoza as a cynical nihilist, because if anybody undresses your cynical nihilism and shows how fucking infantile and immature and stupid it is Spinoza. It's like you cannot avoid it once you go through Spinoza. And at the best, when you go, for example, into Sufi mysticism, it's exactly what you get out of Spinoza. He is the only Sufi mystic philosopher we have in the West. Again, that's how poor the West is. But that's what we need Spinoza for. And I think Spinoza's joy, if you study carefully, is the beginning of understanding heroic mentality. That's a good place to start.
Nice. Okay. Thank you.
My point here with pointing out you, John, is that the heroes are not big. The heroes are lesser gods. There's small people in their communities. That's what the heroic always happens. And once they're on the star level, the Napoleons of the world, they're probably so fucking dysfunctional, driven so much by narcissism, that at best, for example, if you take Napoleon today and study his heroism, it's only because he showed you what you can do if you train an army to read, write, and count. Now, you don't have to train armies to read, write, and count. You can create hospital fighting COVID-19 where everybody can read, write, and count, and therefore they can fight the pandemic better. That's the lesson we must learn from Napoleon. But that's what Napoleon did. That's the only thing of Napoleon today we can see is heroic, because the guys who get the star power, the huge individuals, the heroes we had, they only got there because of their narcissism. But it's in your everyday life you find the heroic. That's always where they find the heroes. The name for heroes, historically and theologically speaking, is lesser gods. The lesser gods are the ones that are heroic. There are the role models. The saints are much more important than the gods when you study religion.
So in a way, from your earlier conversation, the meditators are also the heroes in a way, or that's the practice of the hero, you know, because I get you when I hear you say Napoleon or, you know, all these people, Gandhi, like it's all these rock stars in a way of history, right? It's like it's perhaps our superhero obsession that makes us go to these people first, or aspiring to be that.
I'll give you an example of somebody undressed me completely in my narcissism. And that was another one of these fantastic, generous matriarchs. Her name was Mir Amelsad, and she's a Zoroastrian scholar in India, and she's from the Tata family. She's nobility and all that. So I was in her townhouse. I was pretty impressed with everything and all the wealth she exposed to me, that India was successful, and all the history she knew and all that. And I was standing on her balcony, and in front of her house on Marine Drive in Mumbai, we saw this long line of Hindus lining up to Ganesha temple. And Ganesha, blue elephant, all that, kind of, you could worship Elvis Presley or Mars for all I care, So it's like, so they were standing up there. I was standing there on the balcony. I was now considered a Zoroastrian scholar and a philosopher in India. My God, I made it, right? So I was standing there, and she walked out and she looked at me and said, I see how you're looking at those people lining up to the temple. And I knew she'd saw me, right? And she said, don't you ever again in your life look down on any person who loves their own children. Ever. Because you don't have children, Alexander. And I just immediately recognized, God, who's the hero here? All those Hindu women signing up who love their children, take care of the 3-4 kids and support their kids every day. They're the heroes, not me. Not me. Okay. Lesser gods. That's where you find heroism. You find in everyday life around you. As soon as you start looking around, that's where you find the heroism. And if you can take the heroism now when it's acquired to a higher level, then you look at leadership. We have to look for leadership next. And we know the scapegoat mechanism. We know the mechanisms that are around these days. We know what's happening when people get stuck in their echo chambers and they're frustrated and resentful. And we know the world is full of it today. And we know the internet has created more of it rather than being, a force for good for now. Now we need to turn this whole thing around. And that's how I want to read Girard. I want to be more Girardian than Girard himself, because we have to. That's where I want to go. But
my takeaway from Girard is the joy of being wrong. I mean, I sort of combined Spinoza and Girard because he did Christianize at the end and go for the wrap up. But the joy of being wrong and understanding the dynamic, especially I think in the beginning with Shakespeare, I think that was absolutely brilliant. But I think, Alexander, I see you again and again, and Andrew as well. I don't know the others as well, but your enthusiasm with young voices. I mean, Spinoza was 24 when he got excommunicated. He hadn't written a word. He was 24, And it's like, what space are we making for the absolutely unpredictability of how does an organism know how to evolve? And if you have conversations with Nora, which I work with her as well, I mean, I think that's really where some of the space needs to be made, is for what's actually happening, not what we can predict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nora's great. We had a conversation. She's fantastic. Also an aesthetic thinker. I like people who are aesthetic, and I think you are too. So I said that before, but I noticed that Alex has been saying a lot in the chat. So I wonder if he wants to pop in. I'm trying to find questions in the chat, and I see Alex is saying a lot of stuff. So you want to jump in, Alex?
Yeah. I have a main question, also sort of for Bard. Like Albert Borgman has this idea of that technology takes focal points, like the fire, and sublates them in, for instance, the heating system. So they disappears the focale into sort of a device paradigm, he calls. Now, if we think of economics or transaction as a focal, technology is now going to start disappearing that focal point, whereby economics disappears itself in our very activities, right? And I wonder if by insisting that attentionalism is non-economic, we don't lose our ability to analyze systemicity.
Excellent question, if I may take that one. I think, historically speaking, the people who start from the position of trying to defend the old paradigm are always wrong. So let's be Hegelian in the sense that Hegel taught us to make decisions. because they're only temporary anyway. Let's assume instead, because I think you're going to be a brilliant philosopher of attentionalism, and I'm not going to be that. I just basically put the word out there. I think attentionalism needs to be discussed as non-economic, and it's much more fruitful to think of it as non-economic. So if you then at least start thinking of previous paradigm shifts, it's a bit like every time you told people that industry in cities and factories are going to take over the world, because that's where the value is created from now on, and they would go back to food and go back to food and go back. We must eat and we must eat. And it's like the old nobility wanted to pull us back to the countryside and live in the old farm and be slaves again rather than workers in factories and be slaves in the farmyards and all that. Although they didn't need that many workers any longer because farming was also becoming more efficient because of factories and industrialization, right? Finally, farms became bacon factories and things like that. But if we just look at what happened then, he said it wasn't the people who wanted to defend food production, which is the previous paradigm, but rather people who defended industrial production who were right. So it wasn't about the food. It was about creating manufactured goods and eventually services on a massive scale that created the paradigm of capitalism. Now, if you just skip money, the way you skipped land in the past, it wasn't land ownership any longer, because you could use the money to buy the land. These days, you can use attention to get the money. But if you use attention to get the money, you get enough money you need. But if you're not greedy and only use attention to get enough money so you can get by, you can use the rest of your attention by increasing more attention. So only the most desperate people today sell all their attention to money. The other people know that their attention is going to increase, so they just borrow money from the bank and the money problem is solved, and then they increase their attention. Once you're inside a network, and you sell access to the network, you're dead and your network is over. Okay. But if you're inside a network where everybody's there because of the attentional value they have to the other people in the network's attentional value increases and increases simply because the other networks are so fucking dysfunctional these days that if you just have a network where everybody's there for attentional value, it's a horizontal relationship, there's no hierarchy, and people have joined it because they have mutual attention where everybody's attention increases with all the others' attention in the group. So the overall attention increases. That's not an economy because you're not trading the attention, you're co-creating the attention. That is the proper attentionalist network. And when I start looking at that and I see how mind-blowing that is, I said, I just got, because I'm an economist, I'm a trained economist, I got to get all the economic thinking out of this. It's not about, it cannot be traded outside the network. Because if you try to trade your attention outside the network, you're letting the Russian oligarch and his horse into your nightclub, and your nightclub becomes bad and horrible, and your VIP lounge is killed. Because if anybody buys their way into the VIP lounge, you know your nightclub is dead. You know that because you're also a musician. So it's all about thinking the nightclub metaphor. What does it mean to create the ultimate network of people who collaborate and co-create things? What kind of network would that be? It wouldn't be about the money. It would be about something higher than the money, and that's attentionalism.
Okay, so could I say then that attentionalism is inclusive of economics, but it extends beyond the bounds of economics? But I have to also say that apparently the paradigm that we're entering, no matter what we do, every single activity that is that becomes data is capitalized, or even is the flow of capital for someone, even if intersubjectively, phenomenologically, we're not aware of it. Our behaviors and actions and activities are capital and the flow of capital. So is that still not economics to somebody?
Yes, it is, because capitalism is still there. Food production was still there. Land ownership was still there, but it's subordinated to something called attentionalism. And attentionalism dictates over capitalism. Why do you think we got these low rates? You can go to the bank and just pick up money for anything these days. Why isn't money valuable any longer? Because attention is more valued, and you cannot buy attention. Hey, I'm working with all these marketing people. They pay me fortunes to give them classes on how they're dead. That's the ultimate form of Hegelianism nowadays. They give classes to people saying, you're over. At the end of the day, they paid you to hear the truth. So they can possibly be something else than advertising people, right? So you get them out of the loop that they must stay with the realm. No, you're absolutely, and you spotted something very, very intelligent here. You spotted that economics is now so dispersed, it's so prevalent everywhere that it's in absolutely everything. And capitalism becomes absolutely obvious to us. It's there everywhere. But for all that Google and Facebook try to do, which is get our data and then try to nail the ad, like if we would accept the ads if they were better nailed, like if it was just more me, no, I'd still hate them. That's what Facebook and Google don't get. And now they fool the entire advertising industry, trillions of dollars into going to Facebook and Google ads and create fortunes out of that. This is a dead end. They're doomed because we will, at the end of the day, all stand up to them when we discover what they do and said, I just don't want the ads. What is it that you don't get? We hate spam. And the fact you tried to personify it makes it even worse, right? This is where attentionalism comes in, right? Yeah.
Hence the consummariat is the only one left with ads.
Exactly. So any 19-year-old gets into that. What I'm happy about is I can teach this for 5 minutes to 19-year-old and they get it. So I can teach them, one, that if you do the freemium, you're underclass. And if you can't afford the premium, okay, stay there and accept it and work hard so you can then afford the premium. The premium saves you tons of time. And if you watch YouTube, do you want the ads? No, you don't. 994 out of 1,000 people press the button after 5 seconds. I don't want the ad, get it out of my way. Now, if I would be a marketing person and I walked into a bar and 994 out of 1,000 women walked up to me and spit me in the face, I'd go and hang myself. I don't understand why advertising people don't do that. They're more hated than slave owners ever were. They're over. And finally, we have now with the internet created the possibility of attentionalism. But as any new idea, it will first be an elite that adopts it. And this is where Girard is important. I'm a Marxist in the sense that a new elite, not one person like Nietzsche, but a new elite like Marx can create the new. But the good thing about people is mimetic desire or mimetic behavior, because if somebody has created a model that works, at least the other guys get a chance to create something similar.
I heard there's a New York advertising executive who said that advertisement is poison gas. You know, that's what he was doing it.
I think we've historically been waiting to be able to say it, and now we can finally say it. The way we could only tax slavery, we could afford not to have slavery any longer. It was when factories and industrial production took over. We didn't need slaves to get our cotton, and therefore we could have factories. And the entire American Civil War was just about that. It was industrialism versus feudalism. And that's what we could afford to start getting rid of slavery. Not by being more noble people, not by being more developed. We could just afford to get rid of something that was a nuisance to us. We can afford to get rid of advertising. We must never moralize against previous generations. That's a terrible mistake that woke culture does. But we finally reached a point in history we can afford to get rid of certain things we don't like any longer. But we got other problems we never had before, like atomic bombs. Let's address those.
So we got a few more minutes. Are there any like burning questions from the audience? And if not, maybe we could just hear from everybody some final words, final comments, final conclusions to this rich conversation. And I also want to say, I think it's great to have everybody here like this, and it really adds something to the whole thing we've been doing, because we get a little bit stale, like we get a bit repetitive. We go over the same things, and then when somebody else jumps in, it adds something. It adds a new spirit to what we're doing. It feels like that to me anyway. So I'm really happy with the audience participation this evening. Anybody here? Simon Vale Rocks.
I would just say that any dialectical process is completely necessary. It's completely dependent on its input. So the principle of antagony, for example, to be challenged and to have new points of view thrown into the picture and have new people talking is all about improving on the overall outcome of the dialectical process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, final words from Thomas and Cadell.
I think Thomas disappeared.
Thomas disappeared.
Pretty sure. Yeah, I mean, attentionalism, capitalism, and mimetic rivalry. I mean, The only point I want to emphasize, and what I tried to emphasize, is that I do think there is a beyond of mimetic rivalry. I mean, I do think I don't think mimetic rivalry is our horizon. I don't think we need to go into what seems to me low-level image warfare with each other. And that seems to me to depend on us building a culture which really focuses on spiritual development and understanding how the human spirit develops, which will include stages of intense rivalry. I don't think we can get out of that, but I think the unfortunate thing is that the higher orders of our society don't seem to be embodying those values. So I guess if we do really have a genuine transition to an attention economy, it could lead to extremely disastrous scenarios if we don't think about a genuine, something like a religious layer that's embodied by people who have really been through a deep spiritual process. Last thing to say about that, I suppose, is that I do really agree with what Bard's been pointing towards about creative networks and people not giving their attention away for money. If you can do that, I think that's the correct direction. I mean, a story I told in the year-end review on my channel was that basically at the age of 25, I realized that, I don't know why it was 25, but for whatever reason at 25, I realized that capital wasn't tracking my value in any meaningful way. And so I basically decoupled any of my actual deep attention from capital. And that's made sort of living in a capitalist economy difficult, but I think it is the direction to go and pursue.
Yeah, I would almost like want to say like, hallelujah, amen. That's I agree completely. I mean, I just see religion everywhere as being as not religion, but like, as you say, this kind of our attention to what I would call the divine, which you don't have to even think of in our attention to the divine. For me is heroicism. That's what I'm kind of getting from all this.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and have a great evening, and hope to see you next time. Take care.